Second issue that's at stake right now is the EU budget and the exit settlement. We've said very clearly that we will seek a fair settlement of UK's rights and obligations as a departing member state in accordance with the law and spirit of the UK's continuing partnership with the EU. We've said this month that no EU partner should have to pay more or receive less over the period of the current EU budget, which I think takes us up to 2020. And we will honour all of our financial commitments as a member of the EU. And the third area of current debate and focus is Ireland and the common travel area. That's the fact that between the UK and Ireland you don't have to have a passport, much as you don't in terms of Schengen. So we have a common travel area. The UK places huge value on maintaining the UK's unique arrangements with Ireland and the friendly cooperative relationship we've built in recent years. Both sides want to protect the Belfast Agreement from the late 90s, and we are working to deliver practical solutions as soon as we can that allow the maintenance of the common travel area with the Republic of Ireland while protecting the integrity of the UK's immigration system. It's important to ensure there is no return to a hard border as a result of any controls placed on the movement of goods as part of the settlement between the UK and the EU. Now, this requires detailed discussion on customs, agriculture and other economic matters, but we're determined to find creative ways to solve this issue. And we want to make sure that when the UK leaves the EU, there will be a seamless and frictionless border as possible between Northern Ireland and Ireland, so that we can continue to see trade and everyday movements proceed as we have up to now. Let me now turn to the future economic relationship between the UK and the EU, and that will then lead on to the UK and New Zealand. I've already said that the Prime Minister set out last week her determination to create a new, deep and special relationship with the EU, taking in both economic and security cooperation. We want the UK to have the greatest possible tariff and barrier-free trade with our European neighbours, and also to be able to negotiate our own FTAs with other countries. We want to ensure that UK companies have the maximum freedom to trade with and operate within European markets, and to let European businesses do the same in the UK. And unlike FTAs that have been struck between the EU and other countries, we start in a unique position. Close regulatory alignment, trust in one another's institutions, and a spirit of cooperation stretching back decades, not to mention the fact that trade right now is tariff-free. European leaders have said many times that membership of the single market means accepting the four freedoms: freedom of movement, freedom of capital, freedom of services, and freedom of people. But being out of the EU, but a member of the single market, would mean complying with the EU's regulations and rules without having a vote on what those rules and regulations are. It would mean accepting a role for the Court of Justice of the EU. It would mean still not having control over immigration. It would, to all intents and purposes, mean not actually leaving the EU at all. And that's why we're not seeking membership of the EU single market after we leave the EU, but a bold and ambitious new economic relationship. And as we leave the EU, we will have the opportunity to forge an independent trading relationship. We will introduce a trade bill over the next 12 months to ensure that we have the tools to act as a credible player on the world stage and enhance the UK's role as a global trading nation, negotiating and enforcing a rules-based trading system and driving positive change through trade. We are committed to seeking continuity in our current trade and investment relationships outside the EU, including through those EU FTAs that have already been concluded or other EU preferential arrangements. We have begun to discuss what may be possible with our trading partners in order to achieve this and avoid a cliff edge for business. So this means, for instance, that where the EU already has an FTA with, say, the Republic of Korea, our approach is to seek to just roll that over automatically into a UK FTA with Korea using exactly the same terms and conditions. And there are about 50 or so FTAs that are in that category. New Zealand isn't one of them, but I'll come on to that. Negotiating new and comprehensive UK trade agreements with other countries is a key priority for the government as we leave the EU. The UK has always been a leading voice for free trade, and as a current member state, we are subject to EU commercial policy and will continue to work with the Commission during ongoing negotiations. So let me use that as a stepping off point for the last part of my address, which is about the UK and New Zealand. against the backdrop of what I've just said. I mentioned earlier that our strong support, a continuing support for an EU-New Zealand FTA. We hope that the mandate on both sides will be agreed in the next few weeks, and that negotiations will start preferably this year, but soon in next year. And we'll continue to support that wholeheartedly. But once we leave the leave the EU, we will be in a position to, we hope, start negotiations with New Zealand on an FTA. And there's a lot of work that's already going on in that way. We can't negotiate an FTA, as you know, because as members of the EU, the Commission has competence, sole competence for negotiating FTAs, and we're not looking to get in the way of that. So we've started what's called a trade policy dialogue, and there have already been 3 meetings of this. The last one was just last week in London. Officials from New Zealand are talking to officials from the UK, just looking at issues that we would have to think about at the moment we leave the EU. And this is something that's actually very exciting. And I think I probably stand here more optimistic than I would have done a year ago. I think the last time I spoke was before the Brexit vote. But there's no doubt that going around New Zealand, there is a very clear eye on the opportunities for New Zealand and the UK that have arisen out of Brexit. There's very much a feeling amongst business that the UK should be all right because New Zealand business is all right, and look what New Zealand business went through over the last 30 years, and you can do likewise. So where's the deal? And let's get talking. And it's a very can-do reaction, and it's one that's appreciated in the UK. And I think we'll see over the next 4 to 5 years our governments talking on trade policy. And I hope to see also our businesses taking advantage of the spotlight that will fall on the relationship because of this. It's not, as MFAT or NZTE, New Zealand Trade and Enterprise, would tell you, all about the FTA, and that suddenly once the FTA is signed, bang, lots of deals are struck. Businesses have to take advantage of that. And so it'll be the work of my successor and the team in the High Commission and our trade office in Auckland to work with New Zealand and British companies to try and ensure that the attention, the spotlight that will fall on the relationship is really taken advantage of. And it's worth just reflecting on a few statistics at this point. You export about, it's about $18–19 billion worth of goods to the EU. Or sorry, the two-way trading relationship between the EU and New Zealand is about $18–19 billion. About 35% of all of your exports to the EU go to the UK. And when you look at services, it's a far higher number, it's 44%. So you export more to us than you do to France, Germany and Italy put together. Now, the absolute number or the percentage number of your exports that come to the UK is obviously clearly down on what it was many, many years ago. But it's worth reflecting that in the 1950s, you exported 70% of all of your goods to the UK. By 1973, it was 30. So the biggest single fall in New Zealand's exports to the UK came before we even joined the EEC. And now we're 30, 40 years on, we're in a different era. And the opportunities don't just come from bilateral trade, but from what I think will be some really excellent partnerships. We see this in talking to agriculture, we talk this to beef and lamb, to federated farmers, to wine, to dairy, and they see huge opportunities for partnerships. Because the growth of the global population means that there's an ongoing demand for high quality food. And when you have two countries whose seasons are so similar, if complementary, whose day and night is complementary, I think there are real opportunities in the next 5 to 10 years for UK and New Zealand businesses to align. And I think the last thing I'd say in this space, which is separate to business, which is more in the government space, there is huge interest in thinking about the UK's own national policies as we leave the EU. So our agricultural policy has been mainly set through the Common Agricultural Policy in Brussels. As we leave the EU, we will no longer be a member of that, and we have to decide what our own national farming policy will be, our national agricultural, national food, and a whole range of other issues as well. And the next year or so, you will see several bills, I think it's 8 or 9 Brexit bills, come to Parliament. And that will set not just the terms of our departure of the EU and our establishment of instruments for our trade deals, for our customs arrangements, for a new immigration policy, but also a range of domestic policy. And we already collaborate very closely in this space. If you were here before, you may have heard me say that we took your cabinet manual for how you create a coalition government in 2010. We hadn't had one since the 1930s. So we lent out and said, well, how do you do it? We gave you the source code for gov.uk. If you go and look at gov.nz, it's very similar to gov.uk. It was because we gave it to you. Body-worn cameras. Judith Collins was in London 3 years ago and heard about how we'd experimented with cameras on police jackets, and she trialled it here. And this goes on all the time. And I think we're about to enter a really fertile and interesting period where there'll be a lot more of that. So I'll stop here and take questions, but I think I just want to conclude by saying I'm very optimistic for the UK and New Zealand. I'm slightly jealous of my successor, who will get to be in New Zealand through this period, but I think there are lots of things to look forward to, and thank you for your attention.